friends are synths.
Whenever I feel inspired to make music, nothing will kill off that creative fervour quicker than if I have to spend a lot of time rummaging about in boxes full of old tangled cables just to find one particular power supply that I might need in order to use a specific synthesizer or drum machine or whatever else. And because of that, over the past few years, I've spent a lot of time trying to find a better and more efficient way to manage and organise the different power requirements of my various devices. Now, I have of course labelled my power supplies, and at this point I'm fairly quick at identifying them, and I do have them in a semi-neat way, so that isn't really the biggest concern I've got. But what I really want to do is kind of slim down and reduce the number of power supplies that I've got connected into a kind of extension at any one point. And ultimately, my kind of dream scenario would be to have some kind of desktop power supply device that would allow me to have multiple outputs and very quickly and easily switch between different devices, so that if I wanted to use a synthesizer that had a different power supply requirement, I wouldn't have to go under my desk and switch them out and then hope that the new power supply cable was long enough to reach the synth on my desk or whatever. So this has kind of been my search for the Holy Grail, my search for the Loch Ness Monster over the past couple of years at least. Now, as simple as this sounds, it is more difficult than it may appear at first sight, because not only do you need DC outputs for a lot of these synthesizers, or basically all of them, you also need to factor in the varying levels of voltage that they require. You also need to factor in the polarity of each individual synthesizer, and also the current draw. And even within, the same kind of models or the same kind of manufacturer, let's say Behringer's various synths they've released over the past few years. If you look at the RD6, for example, that is the Behringer 606 clone, it takes, I believe, 9-volt center positive power supplies, whereas if you look at something like the Behringer RD8, which is the 808 clone, it takes something like 18-volt center positive, and then in the middle we've got the different mono synthesizers like the Wasp and everything, and I believe they require something like 12-volt center positive. So even within the same manufacturer who reuses a lot of the same components and stuff, the power supply requirements can vary wildly depending on the circuit. So it's not as simple as just getting one, nice multiple device that will give you lots of outputs. Now, the first solution is something that I've been using for quite some time, and I think it's a particularly neat and elegant approach, and that is to use a bunch of these devices. Now, if you're not familiar with these, although I suspect you probably are already, these are ripcord cables made by a company called allmyfas here in Europe, and as you can see, on one end we've got a USB connection, and on the other end we've got this DC power jack thing, a barrel connector, and on the front you can see that it says 9 volts, and it's also got the polarity mark there. And if you go on their site, you can find a whole bunch of different combinations. So whatever device you've got, you can probably find a ripcord cable that will be suitable for it. And what I think is really cool about this is that you can then ditch your big extension cable filled with lots of different power supplies plugged into it and get a single good quality USB powered multi-hub, and then essentially just have a bunch of these, and it makes switching things over way easier than it would be if you had to use full-size plugs. Now, the only real downside with these, apart from having to find, a good quality powered hub to make sure that you've got an appropriate kind of amount of amperage coming through, or current, I guess I should say, is that these are not the most expensive thing in the world, and for a single cable they cost about £20 shipped, I think. And on its own, that's not too dreadful if you've only got one device or two that you need to kind of accommodate. But when you start to look at multiple combinations of both voltage and polarity, the cost very quickly adds up. Now, the second solution I've seen a lot of people kind of talking about recently has been the possibility of using one of those multi-guitar effects pedal kind of power supply things, a bit like this one here, where you have a whole bunch of different DC outputs along the front. And I'll come back to talk about this one specifically in a second or two, but these can seem like quite an attractive option, because not only do you get a lot of DC outputs in quite a small package, but they also are fairly inexpensive and easy to find. However, unfortunately, generally speaking, they tend not to be suitable for use with devices other than guitar effects pedals. The reason for that is that generally speaking, guitar effects pedals tend to have quite different power requirements from synthesizers or drum machines or other devices like that. And if you look at a guitar effects pedal, they tend to be 9 volts, they tend to require center negative polarity, and they also don't have a huge current draw. And if you compare that to something like a synthesizer, which might be 12, 15 or 18 volts, it might have center positive polarity and it will require a much higher amount of current, then you can see how they're not necessarily naturally or easily compatible. And because of the fixed nature of the outputs in a lot of these kind of power supplies, you're not going to find ones that really are going to give you the juice or the polarity that you need to power your synthesizers. Now, with that said, there are pedals out there that do require a higher voltage, they do require a higher current, if you're looking at something like a digital effects pedal, for example. And because of that, there are some power supplies available that have multiple outputs which cater for these pedals. And this means that they might be more suitable in order to power your synthesizers. For example, the one that I found here, which is Fame branded, I got it from DV247 in Europe. This cost me about 40 quid. And as you can see, not only do we have the kind of standard 5 times 9 volt DC outputs here, but we also have a few different switchable outputs here. So there's one that switches between 9 volts and 12 volts, one that switches between 9 volts and 15 volts, and a final one which outputs 18 volts. The actual current available to the individual outputs here is actually much higher than you usually find on a guitar effects pedal power supply. So for example, the individual DC 9 volt outputs allegedly give off 500 milliamps, and if we go over to the switchable supply and also the 18 volt output, you can see that it says it's got 1000 milliamps, and this in theory means that it should happily power my Behringer Wasp, for example, because that's 12 volts and it is 1000 milliamps. It should also power my Behringer RD8, which is 18 volts and 1000 milliamps, and so more so than other guitar effects pedal power supplies, this one could actually be very good. Now they do have another version of this which is bigger and it gives you multiple 12 volt DC outputs, and so that might have been a better idea. However, it cost an extra like £20 or something like that, and I wasn't really prepared to take a chance on it at that point. Now the one thing I haven't mentioned about this, of course, is the polarity, because even if this gives me 12, 15 and 18 volts at 1000 milliamps on the different outputs here, I still have to contend with the fact that the polarity is going to be center negative, and so I can't just plug in my Behringer Wasp and hope that it'll work, because it won't, and it'll probably fry it unless it's got reverse polarity protection. But there is a way around that, and that is to pick up one of these things, which is a reverse polarity converter cable. And you can see in here that basically the idea is you plug this into this, and then this center negative output becomes a center positive output, and in theory it should work perfectly fine with my synthesizer. So this is what I've been using recently, and whilst it might not be a perfect solution, it is a neat kind of approach that is slightly more affordable than buying multiple myvolts cables, and it does go to show that if you keep an eye out, you can maybe find some better options than this in the guitar effects pedal power supply world. Hopefully that is helpful in some way. Maybe it gives you some ideas of ways that you can start to cut down on the number of power supply units that you have to have kicking about. And if you've got any better suggestions than this, please do tell me, because I am all ears. Thank you. Goodbye.